It was a bright summer morning at one of America's busiest airports, the kind of morning where sunlight poured through the massive terminal windows and turned the polished floors into long silver ribbons. Families hurried toward their gates, dragging suitcases with wobbly wheels. Business travelers rushed past with phones pressed to their ears, already negotiating deals before their coffee had cooled. Vacationers grinned with the particular excitement of people who hadn't checked their bank balances in a week and didn't plan to start now. Among the crowd walked Rowan Hale, moving at the unhurried pace of a man who had learned, the hard way, that panic never made a line move faster. He was in his late 30s, tall but a little stooped, as if he carried more than what was visible on his shoulders. His faded blue shirt had been ironed the night before with the kind of care usually reserved for job interviews. Carefully, on a rickety board balanced across two kitchen chairs, because he didn't own a proper ironing board anymore. His jeans were old, the knees gone soft and pale from years of wear, but they were spotless. He'd scrubbed a small stain out of them at 11 the night before, working by the light of the stove hood so he wouldn't wake his daughter. Holding his hand, actually gripping it, both small fists wrapped around two of his fingers, was Ivy, 6 years old, with a gap where her front tooth used to be and a backpack covered in cartoon stars that was almost as big as she was. Everything the two of them owned for this trip fit into one worn duffel bag slung over Rowan's shoulder. It wasn't much. It didn't need to be much. What mattered was in an envelope in his jacket pocket. A letter, folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft, confirming that Ivy had finally been accepted into an experimental cardiac treatment program 3 states away. Every dollar Rowan had saved over the past 8 months, cutting extra shifts at the auto shop, skipping meals more often than he'd ever admit to anyone, selling the last thing of real value he owned, his late wife's wedding ring, though he'd cried the whole drive to the pawn shop and back, had gone into these 2 tickets. Missing this flight wasn't an inconvenience. It was a countdown. The program had a narrow enrollment window, and Ivy's doctors had been careful, in that gentle but unmistakable way doctors have, to explain that waiting another year was not guaranteed to be an option they'd still have. As they boarded, Rowan smiled at every crew member he passed, not out of any performance of gratitude, but because he meant it. They'd made the flight. They were actually here, actually walking down the jet bridge, actually about to sit in real seats on a real plane. After 8 months of spreadsheets and sacrifice, this alone felt like a small miracle. Ivy pressed her face to the little oval window the moment they sat down, eyes wide, since she had never flown before in her life. She wanted to know why the wing had a light on it. She wanted to know if the clouds would feel like cotton candy. She wanted to know if the pilot could see their house from all the way up there. For a few minutes, watching her chatter and point and bounce slightly in her seat, the world felt hopeful again, lighter than it had in longer than Rowan wanted to admit. Several rows ahead, in the wide leather recline of first class, sat Vanessa Ellington, founder and CEO of one of the country's fastest-growing luxury fashion companies. She was, by any objective measure, brilliant. She'd built an empire out of a single boutique and a stubborn refusal to accept no from anyone, ever, about anything. She was also, by the quieter measure of the people who worked closest to her, exhausting. She demanded perfection from her staff and instant obedience from the world in general, and over the years those 2 habits had fused into something that looked, from the outside, a great deal like cruelty. She wore a tailored white suit that had never once touched a dry cleaning counter without a garment bag, oversized sunglasses she hadn't bothered to remove indoors, and makeup applied with the precision of someone who considered her own face a kind of product launch. 2 personal security guards sat near her, broad-shouldered men in dark suits whose job, as far as either of them understood it, was mostly to nod at whatever she said and occasionally look intimidating on command. As boarding continued and passengers filed past her row toward economy, Vanessa's mood soured with each new arrival who dared to look, in her estimation, insufficiently polished. She caught sight of Rowan several rows back, gently shushing Ivy's small, dry cough with a bottle of water and a soft word, and something in her curdled. She didn't know his name. She didn't know about the letter in his pocket or the wedding ring or the 8 months of double shifts. She knew a worn backpack, tired eyes, and clothes that had clearly been worn before, and she decided, in the space of about 4 seconds, that this was all she needed to know. She leaned toward her nearest guard and said, quietly, but with the flat certainty of someone giving an instruction rather than making a request, that the man in the back was making other passengers uncomfortable, that he looked unfit to be on this flight, that she wanted him removed before takeoff. The guard hesitated. So did the flight attendant standing nearby, who had already clocked Rowan as one of the more considerate passengers boarding that morning, the kind who says thank you and means it, who tucks his daughter's blanket in before his own seatbelt. But Vanessa Ellington was not a passenger anyone wanted to argue with. Her company had donated enough to enough causes and thrown enough weight around enough boardrooms that her name alone tended to end disagreements before they started. Reluctantly, uncomfortably, the request moved forward. 2 guards began walking down the aisle toward Rowan. Every passenger who noticed went quiet, the way a room does when it senses something is about to happen that everyone will remember. Ivy felt her father's hand tense around hers and looked up, her earlier excitement draining into confusion, then fear. She didn't understand the words being exchanged near the front of the plane, but she understood the guards' faces, and she gripped her father's hand tighter, pressing herself into his side. Rowan felt the heat rise in his chest, the old, familiar burn of being looked at and found wanting before anyone had bothered to ask his name. He'd felt it in waiting rooms, in loan offices, in the eyes of people who glanced at his jacket and decided they already knew his story. Years of hardship had taught him a hard lesson, though, that anger rarely fixed anything, and that the worst thing he could do, with his daughter's wide, frightened eyes on him, was give this moment more power than it deserved. So he didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand. He simply pulled Ivy a little closer, murmured that everything was going to be fine, and waited, jaw tight, for whatever indignity was coming. It never arrived. Just as the guards reached the row ahead of him, the cockpit door swung open, and Captain Elias Mercer stepped out to see for himself what was causing the holdup on his flight. He was a broad, silver-templed man in a crisp Navy uniform, the kind of pilot whose calm voice over the intercom had steadied 1,000 nervous flyers over a 22-year career. His eyes swept the cabin once, professionally, and then locked onto Rowan Hale, and stopped. For a moment, he simply stood there in the aisle, cap in his hand, his expression sliding from mild professional concern into something closer to disbelief. Then his eyes filled. 3 years earlier, Elias Mercer had nearly lost everything on a rain-slicked highway outside of Denver. His car had been struck from behind, spun into the guardrail, and burst into flame with his 11-year-old son still trapped in the back seat, the door jammed by the crumpled frame. A crowd had gathered on the shoulder within seconds, dozens of people, phones out, some screaming for help, all of them frozen at the edge of the heat. Only one man had broken from the crowd. He'd run straight into the flames, wrenched the door open with his bare hands, and pulled the boy free seconds before the fuel tank went up. He'd suffered burns down one arm and across his shoulder doing it. He'd refused an ambulance, refused a name in the newspaper, refused the family's tearful attempts to thank him properly, and had simply vanished into the night before Elias, half in shock, cradling his terrified son, could even get his name. For 3 years, Elias Mercer had wondered who that man was. He had told the story to his crews, to his wife, to his son at bedtime 100 times. He had never stopped hoping, in some quiet corner of himself, that he might one day get the chance to say thank you properly. That man was standing 4 rows back, in a faded blue shirt, holding his daughter's hand. Captain Mercer walked the length of the aisle, removed his cap, and pulled a stunned Rowan Hale into an embrace in front of the entire cabin. His voice, when he found it, shook with an emotion no passenger on that flight had ever heard from a captain before. He told them, told everyone, because by then everyone was listening, that his son was alive today, was starting 8th grade in the fall, was alive to complain about 8th grade at all, because this man had run into a burning car without a second's hesitation and asked for nothing in return. The mood in the cabin turned over completely, like weather changing. Passengers who had watched Rowan's quiet humiliation moments earlier now looked at him with something closer to reverence. A flight attendant near the galley pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes bright. Even the 2 guards, still standing awkwardly in the aisle, lowered their heads, visibly grasping how close they'd come to dragging a genuine hero off a plane over nothing more than a worn backpack, and an assumption. When Captain Mercer learned why Rowan and Ivy were flying, the treatment program, the narrow window, the 8 months of sacrifice folded into that soft, much-refolded envelope, he didn't hesitate. He stepped back into the cockpit long enough to make a call to airport operations at their destination, quietly arranging priority ground transport and a direct line to the hospital's intake team so nothing would delay Ivy's appointment. The cabin crew, moved by what they'd witnessed, put together a small gift bag for Ivy before landing. A coloring book, a stuffed airplane, a handful of stickers, and several nearby passengers leaned over their seats to offer kind words and their sincere hopes for her recovery. Vanessa Ellington sat frozen through all of it, sunglasses finally off, her carefully composed expression cracking in a way none of her employees had ever witnessed. For perhaps the first time in her career, she understood, in her body and not just her head, how much damage her assumptions had nearly caused. How close she had come to publicly humiliating a man who had run into fire for a stranger's child, simply because his shirt was old and his backpack was worn. She had built an empire on instinct and certainty. It had never once occurred to her that both could be catastrophically wrong. Before takeoff resumed, she rose from her seat, walked back to row 14, and apologized. Not the clipped, image-conscious apology of someone managing a PR risk, but a quiet, halting one, the kind that costs something to give. Rowan, still holding his daughter, accepted it with the same steadiness he'd shown the guards minutes earlier. He didn't need her to grovel. He didn't need an audience. His strength, then as always, looked less like triumph and more like forgiveness, the kind that costs the giver more than it costs anyone else, and is worth more because of it. Months later, Ivy's treatment succeeded. The girl who had once needed her father's hand just to make it down a jet bridge was, by winter, running across a schoolyard, laughing loud enough to be heard from the parking lot, already making plans for a future that had once seemed like it might not arrive. Rowan kept the letter from the treatment program folded in a drawer, not because he needed it anymore, but because he liked being reminded of how close they'd come and how it had turned out anyway. Vanessa Ellington never forgot that flight either. Within the year, she'd launched a foundation providing emergency travel assistance to families chasing life-saving medical care across state lines. Quiet, unglamorous work, nothing like the campaigns her company usually ran, and she preferred it that way. She told the story rarely, and only ever the same way. That one flight, one man, one apology she almost didn't have the courage to make, had changed the entire direction of her life. Because in a world that so often judges too quickly, by a worn backpack, a tired face, a shirt gone soft at the seams, kindness remains the one thing every heart can afford, and the one thing worth handing out first, before anyone has told you whether they deserve it.